When cable TV was initially created to combat the issue of poor reception in areas where signal received through antennas would be easily disrupted, alienating people who lived in more remote areas. But eventually, it became a system with so many channel options, reaching so many more users worldwide. But things got out of control over the decades, with rising prices, the loss and addition of content that we did or didn't ask for from services that we were paying for, and the rise of digital platforms. A huge number of Americans have cut the cord since 2010, with the total subscribers going from 105 million users all the way down to 68.7 million as of 2025. Cable TV is still surprisingly prominent, considering that tens of millions of people still use it. In this video, we're going to talk about the history of cable TV, the massive decline, and why it still lives on. Cable TV was invented in 1948 with the express purpose of getting broadcasts sent through a much more reliable method. At that time, viewers relied on broadcast TV through towers that sent waves that would be converted into audio and video, then displayed on a television. These televisions would capture these signals through antennas, but the further away that these antennas were from the source, the harder it became just to get reliable service. So they came up with a solution where they could just plug in a coaxial cable into the TV to experience uninterrupted service. You would have to pay a subscription fee in order to access what was then known as CATV, back when broadcast TV over antennas was completely free, but less reliable depending on where you lived. This broadcast service became less and less reliable over time as more channels became available and the airways more saturated. However, during the late 1960s, the FCC heavily regulated what could be shown or heard on television, which kept programming from expanding really all that much. And this was known as the cable freeze. Now fast forward to 1972, the FCC melts its freeze on cable TV, which allows it to expand into showing sports, films, classic movies, and much more, allowing many more networks to be created and grow. Hence, we got one of the most notable networks to rise, the Home Box Office Network, or HBO. The cable industry grew a lot more after investors noted how satellite technology could expand coverage. In the 70s, we got major networks such as Showtime, USA Network, Nickelodeon, ESPN, and in the 80s, the United States received its first major cable news network, also known as CNN. By 1990, cable subscriptions grew astronomically, now dominating the TV market at roughly 53 million subscribers and 79 TV programming networks being available. But with great demand came price increases. Now, cable companies believed that with an increase in networks being added, that they could charge even more for their services. This issue was very concerning, which caused the Cable Television Competition and Consumer Protection Act of 1992 to pass. This forced cable companies to offer local broadcast stations on their channels. This also prevented cable companies from raising prices even further, and it even prevented any single cable company from becoming too powerful. This primarily allowed local companies to continue growing without being cannibalized entirely by national cable companies. Even then, cable companies were working on upgrades to their services. In 1996, broadband was introduced, which combined the coaxial and fiber optic tech to provide high-speed internet access, two-way voice, and high-definition viewing. This was all done through one wire. By this point, there was a ton of competition that gave customers so many choices. This remained the case for many years to come. With such a stranglehold in the market, it was pretty difficult to imagine what could possibly go wrong with cable television. Now, by the early 2000s, we had a precursor to what we know today, video on demand. So through your cable package, which should include a set-top box, you would get access to an interface that allows you to choose what you want to watch, whenever you want to watch it. And in order for this to even be possible, you had to invest in that fiber optic equipment that I mentioned earlier, and that was an expensive upgrade. So just to be clear, fiber optic was not something that you purchased in order to get on-demand services, but you would have to pay higher monthly subscriptions if you wanted it, as you were probably renting equipment from your cable provider. And that's just a quick editor's note. Now, moving on. In fact, cable in general was going up in price. While you had a ton of options available through cable, sometimes you would come across a channel that was either not included in your cable package or was, but then was removed later on. Over time, as the viewer, you notice that some content was being removed or replaced with other content that you're not really interested in paying for. Most viewers probably saw themselves watching just a handful of channels even though they were paying for a large selection of them, and losing any of that handful of channels at any given time outright took a lot of value away from these services. There was a ton of competition from different cable providers, but many implemented pretty similar price hikes, removal of access to channels, and more. And while this was a problem, and one that many acknowledged as a problem, there wasn't that much that you could do about it. At least, this was the case until Netflix made its way in. In 2007, the company Netflix decided to host its content over the internet, offering on-demand content, and a lot of it at that, for a much smaller monthly payment that was free of advertisements. At first, this wasn't as impactful as it became just a couple of years later, as Netflix would include content that was only available on their platforms, and that everyone was talking about. This of course includes Breaking Bad. But it wasn't just one show, it was that Netflix had a lot of shows available on it for you to watch whenever you wanted. Services like these became more widespread, seeing as Netflix was performing so well. A lot of people started looking away from cable, as there just wasn't nearly as much control over the content that you watch as there was on a streaming app. In the 2010s, many people had smartphones, which meant that they had access to services like Netflix on the go, making it more convenient but also much cheaper. Now, smart TVs and streaming boxes were very popular as all-in-one solutions that would defeat the purpose of having a cable box. The limitations of cable were glaringly obvious at this point, and this is when many began cutting the cord. A lot of people cancel their cable packages just to exclusively pay for internet services, as having fast Wi-Fi for less in order to support streaming services was much more reasonable than paying for cable at all. In the middle of all of this, cable companies were trying very hard to maintain their dominance, such as by preventing other platforms from reposting their content by suing for copyright infringement. But the truth is that cable couldn't really compete in terms of price, content, flexibility, and of course, convenience. Cable has been on a steady decline since then, but what could the future hold for this medium? All of these issues with cable TV and the rise of streaming services have definitely had the biggest effect on how many people actually use, let alone pay for cable. So yes, cable does still exist, and millions of Americans still use it. But cable companies have lost over 40% of the customers that they had at their peak as of 2025. And we actually still pay for cable at my house for literally just one channel. But it's also the fact that our cable package is bundled with very fast internet and even complimentary subscriptions to some of these streaming services, with ads of course. So besides people like myself who still have cable but don't really use it at all, what are going to be the reasons why cable still exists? Well, it's not a secret that cable is in fact dying, but it's doing so very slowly. A major reason why cable still exists is because of the funding that they received from Big Pharma, which encompasses an overwhelming chunk of their total advertiser revenue, sitting at around 75% in the United States. But also there are two other forms of content that tends to be consumed over cable: sports, which isn't always streamed online in real time, and of course, news networks. This tends to be the preferred method of consuming news content for a lot of older Americans still. But these things could be phased out pretty easily, and frankly, it's just not very suitable, as cable is still consistently dropping in total users. Cable TV is still offered in a lot of countries as well, including China, Canada, many countries in Europe, Japan, the Dominican Republic, and I could go on and on. So people do still use cable. However, it is not the same dominant industry that it was about 2 decades ago. Even then, in some regions, cable is still a better offering, depending on what you watch and how simple you want your experience to be. However, we can't really rely on cable sticking around for too much longer. I grew up watching cable TV, but I also obviously lived and continued living through the slow death of cable TV. I myself stopped watching cable entirely around since 2016 and 2017. I haven't really looked back. In the following years, there have been so many more streaming services come up, and at this point, there are only so many I'm willing to invest in on a monthly basis to get content. I find most of my entertainment on YouTube nowadays, which for the most part is good enough for me. While I don't miss using cable necessarily, I do miss the charm of it all. Unfortunately, TV as it is now isn't what it used to be when I was growing up, so there's nothing for me to seek through their services. Instead, I can just wear my rose-tinted glasses as I remember what it was like, making sure that I don't miss my favorite shows at the times that they were scheduled to air, and getting up during commercial breaks, of course. And like I mentioned earlier, cable TV is on a steady decline that is only projected to continue declining over the next few years. I have no doubt that cable will exist still in about 5 to 7 years, considering that it does still have a user base. But eventually, I do think that streaming will take over completely. Now, cable TV was a huge phenomenon in entertainment, but before cable, there was another industry that came, one that I would like to explore a little more in the future. We will eventually talk about the rise and fall of broadcast TV, so subscribe so that you don't miss that mini documentary when it comes out. Now, thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and until next time.